Welcome back to Fresh Economic Thinking. You're with Cameron Murray. A special guest today, a real life town planner. Can you believe it? I found one of these people so I can ask them those difficult questions about why they're making housing so expensive. No, let's be serious for a moment. I think it's actually worthwhile understanding what town planning is, does, how it works, how it currently operates before we get too carried away. So, without further ado, Tim Sneesby, all the way from Sydney. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Thanks, Cameron. Good to be here.
Tim and I go back a little way. We've been talking housing for many years now. Tim, how did you get into planning? What's the story? How does one get into this field that is now tarnished with this reputation as the housing affordability scapegoat?
Yeah, yeah. Town planning, particularly councils, I think are seen as public enemy number one when it comes to housing and housing affordability and housing supply. So I did a town planning degree, sort of around 20 years ago now, and I suppose for me, I was really interested in geography at high school, so human geography and physical geography, and so. I think, a lot of that sort of as a social science leans into to certainly part of what is urban planning and how do we create better cities. There is, of course, that built environment piece as well. So that's sort of how I got into it. And I've been working as a planner for sort of around 16, 17 years now. And so I started off working in urban economics consultancy and we did sort of strategic planning and urban economics and with a range of planners and economists. And so that really early experience, and I worked in that part for maybe about 7 years. And so I think that really got me engaged in the relationship between urban economics and town planning. So that was in the private sector and had a range of government, but also private clients as well, developers too. So that was a really good exposure to start my career. Then I spent a little bit of time in London, worked over there as a planner as well. Then before coming back to Sydney and where I've pretty much been at local government for almost 10 years now, actually. So I work in a Sydney council where I'm in the manager of strategic town planning.
Wow. So you mentioned something there, you're a strategic planner. So I thought planners just were like had the little red stamp to deny people who put applications in. What am I misunderstanding? Is there something else happening with planning? What's a strategic planner and why do they exist?
Yeah, it's a great question, I suppose. The average punter, I don't think really knows what a town planner does, and most people, I think, where they interface with the planning system would be with a development assessment planner, which is those people that hold that metaphorical rubber stamp. So, there's many different parts of the planning discipline and many sub-disciplines. You can sort of go into more the urban economics, land use side of things, transport side of things, different types of infrastructure, health infrastructure, education. You can go into quite niche things, urban design, heritage, so on and so forth. So, but sort of broadly speaking, there are really two main parts of town planning. You've got the strategic land use planning, and really that's, I suppose, that's the visionary side of planning, where we say, okay, what sort of cities do we want to make? What sort of neighborhoods, what sort of places, how do we create great place outcomes? And so it's really that piece which takes a long-term view and takes a sort of a broader, bigger picture view and looks at all of the ingredients from land use to built form, as well as the coordination piece of all of the different infrastructure and how can we get all of that to work to create great places and to create great cities ultimately. And when we say great places, great cities, it's really about the public interest and what do we as a community want our cities to look like in the future. So that's the sort of strategic planning piece, and that sets up policies and laws and guidelines. And then the development assessment piece is really the regulatory side of it. So it's really comes down to the minutiae of people lodging DAs for renovations up through to large scale, um, whole precinct redevelopments.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, the strategic planning is about creating essentially the zoning and the rules and which areas are going to, are able to be changed and modified and developed and which will be protected and where people want change and where they don't. And then so that's strategic planning. And then development assessment is actually once those rules are written, people have to property owners make applications and go, I want to do this. Does it fit with those strategic rules you've created? And it's either yes or no. Is that a sort of rough summary?
That's a pretty good simple summary, I think. Yeah.
And so, how do you? I want to get into the operation of these things, but I think it's while we're on this high level um, stuff, the economist in me, and maybe the economists listening in, would say, well, why do we even need you to do that? Even at a high level, won't property owners coordinate themselves and work it all out? How do you and or the planning profession or respond? I mean, what's your take on that position?
Yeah, I think the planning profession ha has been seen as a barrier and frankly as a binding constraint to housing supply and probably as an unnecessary fetter to the free market by a lot of perhaps I'm not sure if it's the right term, mainstream economic thinking and particularly the whole move around deregulation and in particular in recent years this whole idea around abundance, right? So I think that's sort of the view of economists, and so I suppose where planning sits in amongst all of that is I suppose as you've written really greatly about is that urban economies and land markets are really different than the traditional sort of economic model of supply and demand and the way that sort of typical neoclassical model doesn't really fit. And so you've got land, which is a location specific monopoly. Okay, you've got infrastructure provision, which is also a monopoly, right? And so so there's a real need, I think, for public sector intervention to intervene in those markets because I think from my perspective, markets don't create public goods. That they don't create schools. They don't create parks. They don't create all of the infrastructure. I mean, infrastructure being a natural monopoly, you need to coordinate that, right? And so if you're coordinating that, you've also got to coordinate the land use with that, because for governments to say, right, where do we put our electricity and our water and our roads and all that hard infrastructure, but also where do we put the soft infrastructure, the schools and the health, etc. And so if you don't coordinate that, you end up with a scenario where and this is a real scenario in the outer suburbs of Sydney where developers have land rezoned, they're ready to go, but there's no water, and they have to wait for 4 or 5 years for the water utility to actually provide that on site. So that's a really perverse outcome. So given that sort of the way that our urban economy is set up, there's that real need to intervene in the market, to provide public goods, but also, to ameliorate negative externalities, and also to sort of reinforce positive externalities. Like positive externalities, I suppose, things like agglomeration economies. But the classic negative externality is that if everyone was left to their sort of to make free decisions in terms of taking it right down to a site level, they would build the biggest extension possible, which would maximize their views and maximize their sunlight. But all of their neighbours would lose their sunlight and lose their views and lose their amenity, etc. So you end up with a sort of like a tragedy of the commons type
Mm.
scenario where if everyone gets what they want, then no one gets what they want, right? So I think planning, it comes in and to regulate and say, okay, well, what do we all agree as a society as what the common good is, and how do we achieve that with that sort of veil of ignorance? And then it sort of regulates and does that.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing, Tim, is there's sort of two main ones. One is just literally coordinating um, difficult problems that the monopoly, infrastructure providers won't solve, and no one's going to, build their own long connections to the road and sewer and water networks and so forth. So there's this sort of coordinating the hard infrastructure and making sure there's a space for all the things we want to mix in that don't have to sort of outbid, or there's no spots left. We have that thing in Brisbane. Where I live in West End, we've rezoned all this industrial area. And the view at the time, 20 years ago, was, well, children would never live in apartments, so we don't need any school extensions. And of course, the school, when my kids started, had 500 and something students, and now it's got 1,500 students. And they had to acquire a whole city block to expand the school. And now they may have to do it again because no one said, actually, let's find an appropriate spot here and designate it and use the planning system to acquire it. So that's sort of an example I like to share about that role. But on the negative externalities of that real site by site stuff, is that a real thing? Like, don't the yimbys say, oh, if you're going to live in a city, you got to accept some noise and some darkness and overshadowing and having a brothel next to a primary school or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. Yeah.
What, like,
No, 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 no.
where do you draw the line as a planner? How do you
Yeah.
feel this out? Is there like community input? Like, because it's a gray
Absolutely.
area, obviously, and you have to pick a spot, right?
Yeah,
How
for,
does
for
that?
sure. Yeah, look, I suppose, planning, like all of our regulation really is it's a democratic thing. We live in a democratic society, and so we all, as a society, choose what we see as our social norms, and we vote those into policy. Right? That's the model, that's the ideal world, but what we have in planning. It is significant policy capture. That you've written a lot about that in terms of trying to capture that honeypot in terms of the windfall gains. So I think so that's the case, and so um, when people live in properties, when they buy a property, that they make decisions, like they make, it's one of their biggest life decisions, right? They make these, and they based on you know the characteristics of an area, and what sunlight am I getting? What, oh, I like a leafy street, or I like this house is next to this near the bus stop, or it's just around the corner from the Bottle, for example, which my house is. But that's not the main motivation why I bought it. So people make these decisions, and so what planning has done in a way is to sort of codify that, right? So it's like one of the things, for example, in New South Wales, where I work in Sydney, we've got the apartment design guidelines. And so that says, for example, that, on the shortest day of the year, when the sun is at its lowest and when there's more shadows than any other day, um, you know, your living area of a new apartment type development should get at least 3 hours sunlight during that day, right? And that's created a lot of controversy for the sort of YIMBY type groups, and sort of for also, I think, those sort of mainstream or certain economists, New South Wales Treasury,
Right.
like a lot of those economists, they see that as a really unnecessary intervention in the market. And so, you know, there's this one classic argument. Actually, I've got to use this really funny example of what happens when economists plan cities. And I know probably most of your listeners are economists, but this is the view of this is a New South Wales Treasury or Productivity Commission um, piece, right? So it's a government endorsed piece of work, and it got a lot of it got a lot of airplay because it's a part of this whole seductive narrative about planning and causing lack of supply and high prices, and so the government and the media really soaked it up. But this anecdote was to say, we don't need these overshadowing controls because Australia has one of the highest rates of melanoma in the world. So it's actually, and we've got climate change. So actually having more shades better, right? And of course, it's that really, it's almost the classic or perfect example of where when you think about things in a sense which isn't aspatial, right? You think about your models and you say, okay, well, but actually when you look spatially, well, shadow diagrams are designed for the shortest day of the year, right?
Mm.
Where the UV, right, certainly in Sydney, the UV rays are they're below 3. So it's actually about where the sun's really low and it's sunlight penetrating into your apartment. The times of year when the UV exposure is really bad is in the middle of summer, and then that's when the sun goes directly over your roof. Okay, so it doesn't penetrate into your northern northern elevation. It doesn't come through your windows on your north side because it's actually directly above you in summertime. So it's just one of those classic arguments about, oh well, actually shades are a good thing, but what you
Yeah.
find is that if you sort of create a place where there's no sunlight, you've got lots of tall buildings, you get um, dark, like particularly in around centers, you get dark centers, really like they're urban wind tunnels, and they're absolutely miserable places, in winter time and for large parts of the year. So that's really about looking at all of those smaller elements of built design and ensuring that you're creating a place where you can have great place outcomes. So how do we increase housing in a way which responds to that?
Yeah. I've heard that argument before as, oh, we need more shade. I'm like, but this is meant to be the coldest, shortest day of the year. You want the shade at the 6 months later, right? On the longest, hottest day of the year. And you can actually design a building to sort of maximize both as well. Do you think, is there a view in the planning community whether those design guidelines are too strict? Because I think compared to Victoria, for example, which has even shorter winter days, they're much more flexible on, windows in bedrooms and stuff in terms of the nitty-gritty design of actual apartments, which are, these minimum standards are codified.
Mm.
What's the general vibe in New South Wales? Do people think, actually, there's a lot of projects where it's not quite flexible enough? Or do you think actually, developers, architects, designers have really worked out ways to deal with this that make better buildings? What's been
Yeah,
the vibe?
it's really the latter. Like anyone that works in the built environment, whether you're an architect, a developer, a planner that's a planner consultant, right?
Mm,
Who's helping the developer, or in government or any other types of industry, it's really widely accepted that that these standards are not only creating better places, but also creating better um, domiciles for people to live in the future,
mm,
um, and also protecting the amenity of the neighbours as well. To say, okay, well, you shouldn't take away all of your neighbour's sunlight, and
mm.
similarly, your living room shouldn't look directly into their bedroom. So there are these really common decency types of approaches. I think that really the only groups that are really against the apartment design guidelines are groups like the treasury groups and the sort of this YIMBY economics idea that these guidelines are pushing up prices. And so ultimately it really shows a misunderstanding of how planning works, and particularly because they are the apartment design guidelines. And so they're guidelines. And so like
So,
much of the planning system, it's implemented flexibly. And even the guidelines, or not all of the apartments have to have that minimum sunlight. It's something like, I think, only 70% of the apartments,
oh,
right? So,
right.
so there's a lot of misunderstandings about all of this. And, so you will have developments, particularly where I work, where you've got skyscrapers, where the lower levels just can't get enough sunlight, and so the
Yeah.
developers whack all the studios and one bedders down there, and um, and they don't get sunlight, and that's is what it is. And then they, of course, maximize it in other
So I
ways.
wanted to ask you about this flexibility thing. So you've just said there's I'm trying to lay it out for those who aren't familiar with the planning scheme, but there's a strategic plan that basically says what we want where and what a zone means, and what different densities mean and what an industrial use is versus not, or whatever, and where they can go. And then within that, there's sort of design guides like setbacks and standards that apply to different things. Um, so you've now just said that actually you can just apply them flexibly. So how does that work? Like if they're so flexible, what was the point of them? Or can you give me an example of
Yeah,
how they can
yeah,
be
sure.
flexible but still functional? Because I often have this tension. People go, "Oh, that zone means this." I'm like, "Yeah, but people don't have to comply with this. They can make arguments why they can't meet the design guideline in this. Can you talk me through this flexibility that's built in? And yeah, I'm really keen to hear some examples that,
Yeah,
that
look for sure. Look, it really fundamentally comes down to the fact that not every single site is the same. Like, I mean, every single site is different ultimately. So I think for those reasons alone, you need to have an element of flexibility. And so, from the earliest days of planning in New South Wales, where I work in Sydney, um, y- you've had this inbuilt flexibility into the planning system where there are certain rules that can be varied by developers, and things like development standards around height and floor space ratio, like how much floor space you can build on a site. They're really typical things that you can vary, and if you can demonstrate, for example, that you can get an extra story on your development without creating any adverse impacts, without overshadowing any extra houses or public spaces, then you can actually effectively argue for that and achieve that. And so, really, what it comes down to, it's about demonstrating consistency with the objectives of those controls. So you can have planning controls, either in legislation like a local environmental plan, or in a guidelines like a development control plan,
and so
which
what's
says,
a
these are what
control
you
mean?
can.
Like a rule, like a setback or a height limit
Yeah,
or
yeah, exactly
something. Yeah,
right. Yeah, that's right. Like, so setbacks are a classic thing that's in the DCP, we call it,
yeah,
the control plan, which is a guideline document.
yeah,
So it's the most flexible, and then you've got higher order type legislation, which is less flexible, but still has, you know, provides opportunities for flexibility to say if you can,
yeah.
notwithstanding what these controls say about height and the floor space ratio, if you can meet these objectives of of this zone and of these height standards, if you can demonstrate that, then you can potentially receive a, a planning permission or approval to do that. So that's a really common feature of the New South Wales planning system
Yeah,
and
so
of
it's
others, I think, as well.
yeah, in Queensland where I'm familiar, we have written into those controls, which we call, I don't know, we just call them plans, I guess. And we go, what's the objective of this zone or these rules? It's to prevent, for example, too many vehicle crossings across the footpath, right? You can't just have 25 driveways around your building and have all these car park entrances. So it'll be like minimize crossings. And then it'll say, we think if you do these things, you've minimized, you go ahead. So we call them the control or the standard. But if you need to exceed that, you've got to sort of argue, well, we've exceeded this, but we've still minimized it because look at our site. I mean, just look at it, right? Um, so it's almost like these rules are like, how do you put them? They're like, if you achieve this, we're not going to ask any further questions whether you've intended to meet this social good that we want. But if you don't, you have to persuade us that you're meeting this social good without meeting this particular number. Is that sort of how
Mm.
it works?
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, I think, the term for it is they're sort of performance-based control. So if you can demonstrate that you're meeting the performance required,
Yeah.
then you are effectively get the green light. The sort of the old school traditional types of rules, which you can't vary, they're what you would call like prescriptive. They more prescribe
Okay.
it. I think a lot of people don't even understand or know that the NCC, for example, the National Construction Code, it has all of the rules of terms of what you build, but it's also a performance-based code as well, right? So there it has strict things there, but if you can demonstrate to the certifier, so actually,
Mm,
well, I know it says such and such about having a 100 mil drop, away from my front door, a meter away from my front door for water ingress, but if I can demonstrate that by putting a strip drain in front of my front door, then that's going to meet that. And they say,
Yeah.
oh, that's, so I think a lot of people don't even understand that even, things like the NCC, for example, that, there's ways where you can just effectively argue the point.
Yeah. I think a lot of people think, oh, look, the zoning code says this, therefore there would never be more height or density. And they
Yeah.
miss two things. One, you can argue for more whatever anytime you want. But secondly, those zones in the strategic level, when the city plans change. So in Brisbane, we have city plan amendments that come through. Those can change periodically as well. So in New South Wales, how do those high level plans get changed normally, right? So if you've got a city level plan with certain zones and controls or whatever, how often is that sort of reviewed and updated on the whole? Or is it updated ad hoc and incrementally area by area? How does that work?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. And Um, if you'd asked me this question 3 years ago, I would have had a different answer. But um, what we've seen the New South Wales government do here, and I think a lot of state governments across Australia and other parts of the developed world is to sort of adopt this abundance type approach to housing and planning controls and this I think they've sort of adopted this idea that planning is the barrier. We just need to deregulate, and so a big driver in Australia has been the housing accord and the dollars associated with that for state governments to they all get an incentive for increasing dwelling completions, and so New
Oh,
South Wales government as well as
I didn't know about
sorry.
this. The housing accord. How is this monitored?
I don't know the minutiae of it, but it's effectively a 5-year period where the federal government says, "Hey, we have to achieve X many hundreds of thousands of dwellings for each state. Um, you have here's your allocated target, and then the states disaggregate that down to the sort of lower levels, right? And all of that is of course driven by record high migration, and which continues, right? That's the ultimate driver for underlying demand,
Hmm.
not necessarily effective demand in terms of delivering housing, unfortunately. Um, so that's driven a lot of reform across the states because I think that I forget the exact number, but for example, for every dwelling approved, the states get $10,000 or $12,000 or something like that. So the states have gone, whoa, okay, we could get a lot of money here. How do we get all these
Hmm.
dwellings built? And so they've worked with treasuries and development lobby, etc., to work at what are the pain points and how can we effectively deliver. Um, so
And
so
so,
that's
how
so
does
that's
the
but
state change it? Because doesn't the council decide?
well, yeah. So so
So
so,
how does
so
this
yeah. So,
work?
so coming back to the thread here and coming back to your
Hmm.
original question about how do we actually update plans. So um, what I'll explain what the state has done recently in recent years of
Yeah.
reforms, and this reflects a lot of what other states have done across Australia. Is in New South Wales, they've sort of taken this up zone everywhere all at once approach, right? It's a
Hmm.
classic. Look what they did in Auckland. We can do that here, right? And of course, you did that great graph about showing Auckland versus Sydney.
Yeah.
Auckland sort of become that's the poster boy for the IMBY economics, and so they've upzoned everywhere all at once, and not only have they done that with various programs like like the Transit Oriented Development and the Low Mid-Rise program, they're also giving a whole range of bonuses to developers. For example, if you provide X% affordable housing, you can get 30% taller buildings.
Hmm.
And more recently, they've provided an unsolicited proposals pathway. And so what we're seeing all
So,
across
what does
Sydney is
that
these
mean?
effectively it says, regardless of all of the planning rules that we've just created, you can bypass councils, you can knock on our door and say, hey, state government, I know there's actually in this area that council only wants you to build 5 stories, but we've actually got a 50-story tower. And we're going to meet your criteria of X%, 5%, 10% affordable housing, for 15 years.
Hmm.
And the other criteria is that we can build a lot of houses. It's
Hmm.
fairly loose criteria, right? And they're approved on a fairly arbitrary basis. And so what we're seeing happen all across Sydney now is these, and I think probably the public aren't really awake to it yet, is
Uh-huh.
this, you're getting these outcomes where you've got a low density residential setting, uh, and you've got 16 stories approved right next to it. So I think that's, the public, because a lot of that's only just started, the public, it'll be interesting to see probably their reactions when that occurs. So that's what's happened recently. That's all the reforms, but that's really in contrast to the way that planning would do that, and the way that planning traditionally has done that for an age has been to every 5 to 7 years, depending on the growth context, of course. Is to look at your whole suite of strategic plans and look at do your housing strategies, do your employment strategies, your centres strategies, understand how you're growing, understand what infrastructure you need, and work in a way. And okay, well, let's look at our areas. Let's do a SWOT analysis of what are the best areas for future growth, and you do this strategic exercise and right down to the micro scale level where you have urban designers, you have traffic and transport people, you have landscape designers, all of these sorts of people who get down and create master plans, right? So you create master
Hmm.
plans for places and which put all of those things in the mix and say, how can we create great places? And what it does is well, it's really that coordination piece as well. So they can say,
Mm.
this is going to be the next growth area. It gives certainty, really importantly, it gives certainty to infrastructure agencies and also to councils. Infrastructure is so incredibly expensive to build. If you're going to build a train station, if you're going to build a school, you're building it in that location, right? So to say to some developer who might want to come down the road and say, well, actually, I want to build over here instead on this farm.
Yeah.
It's obviously going to create perverse, there's certainly perverse incentives to do so, but it just creates these perverse outcomes in terms
Mm.
of coordinating. So, and I suppose just to quickly summarize, under that strategic approach that we've had, that strategic coordination piece, Australia and Sydney just approved the most, like in the last decade, we've just approved the most houses we ever did. And if you look at the OECD stats, you can see that Australia, as a percentage of the housing stock that we had, we just approved so much new housing as a percentage of the stock that we had. We're, I think, in the top five, I think maybe second in the world in that table, right? What's, of course, let us down is the fact that, we've had really, really high, like unprecedented population growth. And so that the numbers don't look good against that. But,
Yeah.
in effect, under that traditional planning system, you've actually seen really, really high rates of construction and dwelling growth.
So I'm going to ask you, I mean, all of that I agree with. I'm gonna ask you a bit of a technical clarification, and then I'm going to play devil's advocate here and push back a little on, what planners do and don't do, and maybe the arbitrariness of this whole exercise. So the first clarification is when you look at data on, for example, housing approvals, we use this word approval to mean two things simultaneously, right? Because if I want to build a building, um, I usually need to get a planning approval first, right? I want to build a high rise or a shopping center. I got to check that that complies with these strategic plans and all the controls. And if it doesn't, I got to argue why I'm meeting the objectives. But once I've done that, I may not build it. I may go, let's see if I can rent out this shopping center now. And if people want something different to what I've designed, I might come back and get another approval or a modification. So I can now have Aldi and Coles, not just Coles. And maybe I want a big W and I've changed the layout. Or maybe I need more parking to get, you know, some other tenant there. And so I can come back, get multiple planning approvals. And only when I'm ready to build do I go and get a building approval, which says, yeah, the design of my building looks like it's going to stay up and complies with all the codes, not the planning approval. So, so the ABS data on building approvals is nothing to do with the planning system, right? Do you find people confuse that all the time?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, it's one of the biggest causes of error in terms of looking at building approvals because or planning approvals or dwelling approvals, which is a planning thing. Building approvals is what planners, what we would call is a construction certificate.
Ah,
Okay, so a lot of people and governments do this as well. They get the aggregate building approval data, and um, that's really misleading because, as you say, not all DAs go through to CC and construction certificates. So the DA is the conceptual approval of what it looks like and what its impacts are. The
mm,
CC is the construction level of documentation, your structural drawings,
yeah,
um, all of the levels of details in terms of the minutiae for having all of the technical people to sign off to make sure the building's up to code and
yeah.
habitable. And so, an interesting stat in Sydney is that, in the last 2 years in Sydney, less than half of DAs went on to get a CC. Okay, so
Do you mean
you know,
within the
the,
year or like
no,
from 2 years
within the
ago?
last 2 years, right?
So all
I mean,
the
this is
DAs in the last 2 years, half of them haven't applied and got their construction certificate so they can build it.
That's right, less than
Less than
half,
half
right?
within
So
two
there was
years. Okay.
this was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald last year, and so Um, so the question for me that those sorts of things are like smoking guns as to, how can planning be the binding constraint on housing supply in Sydney when you've got less than half of these things are actually going through to construction?
Yeah. So it's a real confusion, and people misunderstand that getting a planning approval doesn't mean you're in a hurry to build, right? Only when you sign a construction contract and start committing to paying that are you really in a hurry. All you've paid is a few consultants, and now you've got this plan. You can build, and you can shop around, you can pre-sell, you can pre-lease, and you can modify. And what happens, I know lots of examples in my area that have become internet memes in the sort of, housing affordability, it's all supply and bad planners. People have gone, oh, look, the council's not approving this. I'm like, mate, the council approved their plan in 2012. Then they approved their modification in 2017, and now it's 2026, and they're approving a like fourth or fifth variation of some new
Mm,
thing that they
yeah.
think is going to make more money. And you are somehow saying, "Oh, council, you're not fast enough to approve the sixth or seventh different planning approval in the last 15 years and they didn't build the last five of them." Because they weren't happy with the construction prices or the market, or thought maybe they'd wait for an amendment to the planning scheme. Like it's just is this misconception. Is that something you come across in Sydney, or is it maybe more
Oh, I
common in
mean, yeah,
Brisbane?
no, without a doubt, it's really, and I think it's state governments and the media really creating this narrative, that they
Mm,
sort of use these straw man type arguments and say, and they pick like the most NIMBY type council, right? Like this area which is, full of old heritage detached houses and say, hey, look at this council. They just refused a DA for a block of apartments. See, this is the reason why councils are, causing unaffordability crisis. That's why the young people can't live in that suburb. Despite the fact that those new apartments would be all $3 million each. But so they use these elements where that they create these straw man arguments, and I suppose any type of persuasive argument there's even if it's not true, it has an element of truth, right? And so it ignores the fact that in Sydney or in New South Wales, like over for a long time, I think at the exact state, I think it's over 96% of DAs are approved. People I don't think
oh wow.
understand that, right? And so that example you gave is a really it's a really common one where something gets a DA approval, and then it goes through various iterations trying to seek more and more. And there are often really good reasons why developers don't build. And frankly, in Sydney, what we've seen, in the last couple of years has been this feasibility crisis, right? So
Mm,
apart from the most wealthy premium parts of Sydney, like apartments don't stack up. So
yeah.
there's this sort of what they call a feasibility crisis, and so that through no fault of their own, these developers they just can't build because they can't get finance, they can't get the right sale price, and so the great irony, of course, is that they need prices to go up for them to create more
Mm.
supply, and
Yeah.
so. Of course, people that really understand how the housing market works, they know this stuff, right? And they know how the relationship between supply and prices works. And but this going back to the thread and to the original question, we had a site where I work where, it was approved for, I think, four-story apartments maybe in 2016. They came back years later to get tried to spot rezone that site to get, more of a tower there. That didn't get approved. And then, the state government changed the rules recently. And so then they were able to do, I think, maybe 8 stories there via that sort of upzone everywhere all at once
Hmm.
thing. And then they've come back again under the Housing Delivery Authority, the unsolicited proposal approach, and they're getting 16 stories. Okay, so it's this
Wow.
like it's this classic story of like, it's really this story of trying to capture economic rent, right? Rent seeking.
Yeah.
So they could have built four-story apartments, but 10
10
years
years ago.
ago. Okay, and so um, so I suppose it's that side of things that planners we see every day in our jobs, right? But if you picked up a paper or you listen to the state government or to the state treasury or to some of these um, you know, interest groups or lobby groups, that's sort of been captured by this idea. It's all about planning, and so you would never, yeah, you don't get exposure to those sorts of things, I think.
So let me then ask, how do planners and developers get along in general? It sounds like, you're always pushing back. They ask for more. They go, no, well, wait, can we have this modification? It sounds like you are representing the community in a constant bargain. Are they as adversarial, or do they appreciate that there's some planning going on? Because I always say no one loves planning more than developers, because go and look, they just all they do is master plan this community, master plan this, look at this stage one plan. um, and they just really restrict who and what and how things look in their own estates. Is that the case, or is it quite adversarial day to day?
Look, I think it really depends on the probably the personalities,
Oh,
I
really?
think, and but ultimately, planning's really professionalized, and to the extent that council or government planners, they're really dealing with planners who are working for the developer. It's very rare that you would be
Right.
talking to the actual developer themselves, right? You're talking to a consultant or a consultant team that the developer's paid. So, it's this whole professionalization of the development. And so, that they hire really smart planners, who argue the case. Okay. And so it's a really professional relationship. Okay. I think in terms of, your planners, you're just arguing the case that, that's obviously, you know, going to serve your client's interest, and we're planners, we're arguing the case that's going to serve, to meet the guidelines or the legislation. So it can be adversarial, but really that's something I think that's when it comes down to personalities. I think if you've got,
Okay.
um, people who, push the envelope too much and are, aggressive or rude, but then, it can become adversarial. Yeah, but it's a personality
Okay.
thing, I think.
Interesting. Yeah, I always wonder, right? These, lawyers, obviously, they're bargaining via the judge constantly. I mean, they represent both sides and they argue their case. And I guess planners, one represents the community interest, one represents the property owners, and they bargain about the rules that have been set. But what that leads me to ask then is, wow, there's a lot of planners getting employed in this process. Are there perverse incentives for planners to just write more rules, just like there might be perverse incentive for lawyers to write more rules to keep themselves in business, or other consultants? Do you think that's a real thing?
Um,
Um,
look, I suppose, there's sort of, you can see where the logic would be in that argument, right? I suppose what you're saying is, do you get ambulance chasing type planners,
well,
who are,
I guess I'm just putting my YIMBY hat on, pardon me, saying, well, it sounds like these, for example, The height controls you mentioned, there was someone who got a 4-story approved, then an 8, now a 16 under a new state government rule. It sounds like they're really arbitrary, right? And so, if they're so arbitrary, why have them and then have all these planners employed bargaining? Why not just go, all right, you do whatever you want, but you just like have the performance only and not the control, and say, if you, as long as you're not sort of imposing, blocking someone's light from their solar panel and looking in their bathroom window from your lounge room, then do whatever you want. Like, do you see what
Yeah,
I'm saying? Do
I
you
get
think
that.
there's
Look,
a bit of that, or
yeah,
do you,
yeah. Look,
yeah,
I'll answer the first part of your question, which is about, are
like creating
is
rules to create
yeah,
jobs for
is there rules
planners?
to create rules to keep us in a job? And I'd say no to that because you know, planners, we don't love rules in and of themselves, right? It's we love creating great outcomes and rules codify that, right? And so, um, but I mean, one of the irony I think sometimes that I see is, in the planning consultant industry, there's the loudest voices that often call for planning deregulation are those consultants. And of course, that they're on forums like LinkedIn and they're trying to sell themselves to their prospective clients and to their current clients and to say, look, hey, I'm increasing my profile and I've got a voice and I'm calling for deregulation. And so I think that's part of the game. But obviously the irony is that if you deregulate it to the nth degree, then of course, that puts them out of a job. So but the second sort of part of the question is that, well, um, if you can just continually keep getting more and more bonuses, doesn't it just show that the planning is arbitrary? Yeah. So, and I suppose in response to that question is that really that shows that it doesn't show that planning is arbitrary. What it shows is that planning is really highly susceptible to policy capture, and capture by you know private interests that I think want to privatize benefits and socialize the costs, right? And so, so you went, and this has been, features of the industry for a long time, where you get, in New South Wales, I think, the development lobby is incredibly powerful, and incredibly politically connected as well. You
Mhm.
look at those various actors there. It's all I'll do is, I suppose, maybe refer to Game of Mates and say that there's revolving doors, and there's it's really frankly quite shocking, in terms of that game of mates. And there was I think an the media hasn't been probably holding the government to account in a way that I think they should, but certainly there was an article last week here where a former premier of New South Wales has become a lobbyist for property
Oh,
developers.
right.
And there was an area out in far western Sydney where they said, "Oh no, this is all flood zones. We can't build houses." And then this lobbyist got involved, the former premier, and the Sydney Morning Herald was questioning and saying, "Well, hang on, is this now that this lobbyist has been involved and has been lobbying the premier, and now we're actually seeing that houses are being approved here."
Mm,
And there's similar. I think there's a similar question about a high rise in the inner city part of Sydney as well. And there was a question about, well, hang on, is this like how is this a proper process? And so um, certainly there are question marks around grey gifts,
yeah.
as you called it in Game of Mates.
So I guess to get back to that point, like, so, the minister comes in and says, actually, no, you can have 16 stories here, whatever. That minister represents a government which represents people democratically elected at a different scale to the council, who's elected and implements controls and other democratic processes that planners rely on to extract, what people want from their areas. How do we know which one's right and wrong? Like, how do we
Yeah,
know which group's interests we should prioritize in strategic planning? Let's say, like in the general high level. I mean, on the site by site controls of setbacks and footpaths, like, you can sort of see the immediate neighbours have a high interest there, but in that more strategic one, I mean, how do you know who the right demos is, the right
Mm.
group, and how do you, New South Wales has small councils, and obviously they have electoral incentives. Um, how does that work? And do you notice a difference? Like if you only ask people on this street what to do, they'll also do nothing every time. Is that a true thing as well?
Um, Well, I'll answer, I suppose, the last question
Mm.
first, which is, if you ask people on the street, do you want this development in your street? They'll say no. And, that's the sort of classic NIMBY characterization. And absolutely there's an element of truth to that. NIMBYs exist, NIMBYs are real. But what's massively overblown is the commentary about how much power NIMBYs have. Right,
Uh-huh.
they have very little power in the New South Wales planning system. But again,
So
what
if I
happens is,
write, so if someone applies for a DA in my street and I don't like it, and I rally the troops and my neighbours, and we all write nasty letters to the councillor and make submissions to the DA approval process, what happens?
well, if there are, if you argue the point on planning merits and you point out and say, okay, well, this development, it's supposed to meet X control. It's not meeting that control, and what it's doing, it's creating this really perverse outcome, which is impacting nearby residents, or it's going to impact, the footpath, or how pedestrians use that space, or conflicts, or any sort of land use conflicts, right? One I looked at today was, for example, the impacts of, restaurants right next to residential. And, oh, well, so if they said, oh, well, that place, they haven't got the right noise attenuation, like that, if you made that type of submission and you were correct, um, then that's the type of submission that say, oh, okay, well, that's good. But that obviously, so
But
that
that doesn't
has weight.
mean it doesn't prevent it, right? So if the applicant just
Oh, no,
says, "All right, we'll build a wall here to prevent noise,"
well,
then they've
yeah,
solved that problem.
exactly. And by and large, the planner would have addressed that in the first place anyway. Like the planners know the rules. So,
Yeah,
so where
right.
you identify something where it doesn't suit the rules, and you're identifying an impact, which, for example, someone might point out, actually, I've looked at their plans, by the way, and their plans are wrong. And this has happened. They say their plans are wrong, and this is actually what it's going to do. And then you'll go out and sign. You go, oh, actually, yeah, thank you for pointing that out. So that's like an effective submission, right?
Right.
If people say, um, you know, if you get 500 submissions and people say, I don't want this supermarket on my street. If it complies with the zone, right? It's a permissible land use. It doesn't matter if you get 5 million submissions. Like if it meets all of the planning requirements, then it gets approved. So and again, I'll go back to the point that, over 95 or 96% of DAs get approved, right? But again, it comes down to those straw man type arguments where, a certain NIMBY council might refuse a Woolworths on their main street. And that becomes again
Hmm.
the front page story, right?
Yeah.
Oh, he's planning to do it again. So but you don't see, what I think planners see is by and large, not only at the DA level, but even at the strategic planning level. So uh, ultimately, at the end of the day, you could get scenarios where strategic plans don't get approved because there's community pushback. What happens typically in those scenarios is that those plans are reworked, or historically you might have state government come over the top, right? So even at that bigger picture level, it's never really been a blockage or a barrier to development, and certainly not at an aggregate level.
Yeah, right. So do you think then at the local, through the council elections and the council laws and the creating the controls, are these DCPs or whatever you call them, are council rules, right? Council level rules.
Yeah.
Is there power at that level of electing a council that creates really, really strict rules and is that
There isn't, like, I mean, there certainly is, but at the end of the day, DCPs, that they are like that, the rules that council control, like DCPs, they're guidelines, okay, and so they're design guidelines, and so you really. they have to make sense. You can't create cumbersome rules that don't make any sense because you'll get taken to court and you will lose.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
there are checks and balances, right? We've got to, you know, sometimes we've got a really perfectly functioning democracy when that works. But perhaps if I can come back to the point that who's right? Is it the local councils representing their residents, or is it
Mm,
is it the state government who's saying that representing this sort of aggregate view? And that is a sort of a narrative that gets played out in the media is that, well, councils are only protecting their small interests and they're only protecting the current
exactly.
residents. They're not protecting future generations. They're not looking at the bigger picture. And certainly, some of those criticisms are probably valid for sure. Like, I don't think really many institutions plan well for future generations or future users. And I think councils can be parochial for sure. But really, that question is: do you believe this YIMBY narrative of the government, or do you believe sort of NIMBY councils? It fundamentally comes down to what you believe. What is planning for? Like, does planning create? Uh, does it create great outcomes? And so I think that message about how that works is really been lost. And then the other one is about, um, we have a housing crisis, and has town planning and has local councils caused that? And so if the state government can convince you that, you know, both the planning system has been the handbrake on supply, and that's increased house prices, then they can, of course, have this scorched earth policy when it comes to town planning. They're happy to burn the city down and start again if they, believe that that's going to create this affordability. And so really they're sort of appealing to this, particularly renters, I suppose,
Mm,
and it's the idea to say, well, guys, let's forget about any of our demand levers, okay? So don't worry about any of that stuff. Forget that stuff. Let's just focus on these supply levers that we have, and believe us when we say that, it's going to be these factors, and we need to do that. And so I think, yeah, councils absolutely can be parochial, I think it comes down to what you believe in terms of what's causing the housing crisis.
interesting. Something you mentioned there was, do we want great cities? And I guess, I've always said you can have cheap cities by making them bad cities, right? Where people don't want to live, their salaries are low, it's a lot of crime, it's not beautiful. That's one way to keep prices down, I guess. The last thing I know, you've had a long day, Tim, and I appreciate your time. You said you worked in the UK, and one thing I hear often is the zoning controls are too strict. We just need a performance based where you propose anything and we assess it. And my understanding is in the UK, that's what they have. You basically propose something and we all have a bargain about it. And they don't really have as many controls. Which would you say is more functional? Because I guess the humorous part of this is California has very strict controls and they want to be more performance based like the UK. And the UK has essentially few controls. They want to be more, you know, legalistic or just stick to if you meet the control, you're approved. So they sort of, the grass is greener situation here of both of them having the same, post COVID housing boom that the world's seen, and they're trying to swap. What's the sort of main difference between New South Wales town planning and the UK?
Yeah, so I think, as you say, the UK, they don't have the traditional zoning that we have in Sydney and New South Wales, and that you have in the USA as well. So they don't have those sorts of rules in terms of um
So you can
you know
propose anything. You buy a block of land, and
well
you're
well
like,
well,
oh, I'm
well no, they
doing
do.
a
Well,
circus
so
here.
that's I think that's a real that's a real misconception,
Oh,
because the funny thing is they actually, you know, my view is that in a lot of ways and I actually don't know. I haven't looked at the British planning system in recent years, to be honest. So I'm going back over a decade ago, but they have a lot of controls. But it's, and yes, it's technically argued on a site by site basis, but the way the controls are set up there, it's such that it's really difficult, I think. you can't just simply say, I want to build an apartment tower in this low density residential neighborhood, because there are certain rules about, what uses are compatible next to each other. And the interesting thing, like, I remember when I was working in the UK, that there was this, in terms of like town centers, like retail centers, right? We have zoning to say you can have all different types of uses. We can't control, of course, what goes where, though. That's up to the market. But in the UK, they actually had detailed controls about, okay, level A retail uses are these sorts of things,
Oh, wow.
restaurants, cafes, pubs, blah, blah, blah. Level B retail uses are these, blah 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 blah, and then right down to level D. These are banks, real estate agents, and so they actually get to the minutiae of trying to curate main streets.
Oh, wow.
And you could say that's over the top, but perhaps you could also say that, well, what we don't want in our main street is a proliferation of real estate agents, or commercial offices at ground level. We want retail. We want to activate this, these town centres because of the role that they play. So I think there was some merit in doing that. Definitely, it's a lot more detailed than you'd ever see in New South Wales. But yeah, the idea that it's less prescriptive than New South Wales is certainly not the case.
Oh.
They just have a different way of doing it. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, we might have to wrap it up there, Tim. I feel like we've clarified a lot of how plans and controls and zones work, and what's a strategic plan versus a control, and what's a DA versus a construction certificate. I really appreciate your time. Are there any other sort of misconceptions or things you encounter that you want to just touch on before we wrap up? Or have we done a pretty
Uh,
good
we,
job?
We've covered a fair bit of ground, I think, tonight. Given the late hour, nothing jumps out at me in terms of many other things I want to say. But yeah,
Well, I appreciate your time, Tim. It's nice to sort of go to the source and talk to a planner about planning, because I know economists have held a lot of strong views on how planning works without really understanding the process or the history or its functions. So thanks once again for coming, Tim.
appreciate it. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.